I found just today an article from National Public Radio about new legislation restricting what teachers can discuss. And just to mention a few of these things, it says that since January 2021, there are 35 states that have introduced 137 bills limiting what teachers can teach with regard to race, American history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And quite a few of these are mainly focused on historical topics. So, for example, in South Carolina, there's a law that's been passed that prohibits teachers from discussing any topic that creates, quote, discomfort, guilt, or anguish. And so, if you're going to talk about things like the history of slavery in America, or the treatment of indigenous people in the past, those sorts of things teachers are sort of afraid to talk about because of all of this sort of legislation. So people are sort of very concerned about what young people are being taught in schools about history. And so how I got into this recently, I wrote a book which came out in 2018, which is about the work of Howard Zinn. So he wrote a book, I'm holding it up here, A People's History of the United States, originally published in 1980, revised many times since then. And how I got into this project is the president of my university. I'm at a branch campus of Purdue University in Indiana. And the president of our university, a man named Mitch Daniels, he's a former governor of the state. And it came out that while he was governor, he had sent an email to some of his subordinates. And it was about that book that I just held up, that book by Howard Zinn. And this is what he said in his email. This terrible anti-American academic has finally passed away. This happened when Zinn died. The obits and commentaries mentioned his book, A People's History of the United States, is the textbook of choice in high schools and colleges around the country. It is a truly execrable anti-factual piece of disinformation that misstates American history on every page. Can someone assure me that it is not in use anywhere in Indiana? If it is, how do we get rid of it before more young people are force-fed a totally false version of our history? So here you have a governor talking about trying to get rid of a book that might be used as a textbook in courses. And so I got interested in that, and I researched it a bit, and I ended up writing a book almost as big as Zinn's book, and this is called Xenophobia, which is a bit of a pun, about people being very kind of afraid and worried about Zinn's book. So basically what Zinn is doing, and I'll just sort of mention this to talk about, the different ways of approaching history. Bear with me a second here. So basically, standard histories before Zinn wrote his book, which came out, as I said, in 1980, they tended to sort of celebrate the great leaders in American history, the presidents, the Supreme Court justices, the military generals, people of that sort. And they had a tendency to sort of downplay the ugly sides of American history. So kind of soft peddling things like slavery, like the treatment of indigenous people, propping up brutal dictators around the world, sabotaging elections overseas, assassinating foreign leaders, all of that kind of stuff would tend to be either omitted or very much downplayed. And so Zinn's book was different in that he did highlight some of that kind of material. And also in his account, sort of the heroes of American history are rarely the leaders that I just mentioned. He thought the more positive things that have happened in American history have tended to be due to popular movements agitating for peace, racial and sexual equality, improved working conditions, environmental protection, and things of that sort. He also gives a lot of credit to artists of all kinds, writers, poets, filmmakers, painters, people who have sort of helped shape our thinking about these sorts of things. So it's a very different kind of orientation than you would find in most standard history books. So to give you a little bit of the flavor of how it's different, and this sort of shows the different approaches you could take to history, the book begins, this is Zinn's book I'm talking about now, it begins with a chapter on Columbus. Oftentimes the sort of story of American history begins with Columbus, coming to the New World in 1492. And so he quotes from Columbus's journal. And so he speaks, Columbus does, of as his ship was coming ashore, the Arawaks, sort of native people who were greeting him, they ran to greet him. They brought him food and gifts. And then he wrote in his log, I'll quote a little bit of this, they brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. So right off the bat, he's talking about enslaving them. And then it goes on in his journal, just to read one more passage. He says, as soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts. So he's saying, yes, we took them by force. And when he speaks of giving information on whatever there is in these parts, it was mainly gold. He wanted gold. And so he ordered the natives to give him gold, and they were very harshly treated if they did not do so. So the next point I want to make, and this is a point that Zinn makes, is that when you're doing history, you can't avoid being selective. There are so many things that have happened. You can't describe or discuss all of them. You have to sort of focus on what you think is most important or most interesting or most relevant or something like that. And so what Zinn found is in the standard histories, when they talk about Columbus, they usually don't mention much about his treatment of the indigenous people. It's a much more positive treatment. Now, he does mention one prominent historian named Samuel Eliot Morison. And Morison, sort of the leading Columbus scholar, and he wrote a book called Christopher Columbus Mariner. And Zinn points out, to his credit, Morison does not completely ignore this. There's a sentence in there where this is Morison now, who says, the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. So think about that. Genocide is about the harshest word there is in the English language. I mean, genocide refers to the attempt to wipe out an entire group of people, like an entire race or an entire ethnic group. We speak of Hitler's attempt at genocide against the Jews. So here is Morison writing this book about Columbus, and he has that one sentence where he calls what Columbus did cruel and said it resulted in complete genocide. But as Zinn points out, that's just sort of one page in a 500-page sum book, and all the rest of it is positive. So, for example, in the conclusion to the book, Morison had written about Columbus, he had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great: his indomitable will, his superb faith in God and in his own mission as the Christ bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. And so the point that Zinn is making here is that it's not that Morison lied. He didn't do that. And it's not as if he completely omitted, this sort of negative information, but he glossed over it very, very quickly and focused instead on this sort of more positive stuff. And that's kind of what Zinn is saying that the standard history textbooks tend to do. They really sort of play up whatever is positive in American history and either ignore or downplay anything negative. So, one more point about this Columbus thing before I move on to something else. Zinn argues, Columbus is long dead. So it's not as if the point is that we have to kind of judge him or anything. It's kind of too late for that. But how this is relevant to the present is that approach to history communicates the message that, murder, slavery, oppression, that's sort of okay if it leads to good results, if it leads to sort of progress and so on. That's sort of the implicit message. And I think that's one reason why there is all of this fighting now, all these states passing laws where you can't say too much about things like slavery or the Jim Crow era of the South, where there was legally enforced racism against Blacks. Let's kind of not talk too much about that. Let's talk about what great progress we've made in overcoming it. And so Zinn's argument would be the reason for that is a desire to sort of keep alive the idea that it is okay to outrageously sort of oppress and attack others if we're sort of pursuing our own power and our own interests.